You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, BP announces plans to accelerate its green commitments after recording its highest annual profits for 8 years. Government sources tell Sky News they're unaware of any Treasury requests to the Business Secretary after the Chancellor is accused of trying to fast-track oil and gas projects. And the UN warns that 13 million people in East Africa are facing severe hunger because of drought. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. Now, it's one of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world, and now BP has just got bigger, recording its highest profit in 8 years. It's the second oil giant to record huge earnings in a week, after Shell announced more than £14 billion in profits. But it comes as many people are facing a cost of living crisis with soaring energy bills. So the calls for a windfall tax have grown louder. But BP's chief executive pushed back today, saying that that tax wouldn't fix the problem, and he promised to transform the company into a low-carbon energy business. So let's take a look at how BP is investing in a green future. Well, the oil and gas major today reported profits of £9.5 billion for 2021. Now, that's after a loss of £4.2 billion the previous year. Now, the company previously said that it would cut its operational emissions by between 30 and 35% by 2030. Well, today they announced that they would accelerate those plans and halve their emissions by then. Well, BP also announced plans to increase investment in low-carbon energy, such as electric vehicle charging, renewables and hydrogen, to more than 40% of total spending by 2025 and to 50% by 2030. Our business correspondent, Helen Smith, reports.
Let's go to the wall.
Struggling, it seems, is now standard.
I've used up all my savings.
What is this additional cost of living going to do to disabled people?
Food is expensive, petrol is expensive.
A small selection of people on a Sky News show speaking to a nationwide squeeze. But many are also enraged, and this is partly why. Laid out in a glossy presentation, the high prices forcing bills up have made BP billions in profit. The oil giant made $12.8 billion last year. That's about £9.5 billion. It was a similar success story at its competitor Shell, $17 billion for them. And it's a dramatic turnaround from 2020, when the pandemic and plunging oil price led BP to losses of nearly $6 billion. It'll mean larger dividends for shareholders, but there were promises too on how some of that extra cash will be spent.
We need to accelerate the transition. For every pound that we make in Britain, we're going to invest £2 at least.
But for many, that's just not enough. Not for the first time, the profits of these private companies is becoming political amidst a severe cost of living squeeze, where as many as a quarter of UK households could be facing fuel poverty. Many see billions of pounds in profits as deeply unpalatable. Calls are mounting for the Chancellor to claw some of it back. And that could be in the form of a windfall tax, a one-off tax on those profits. It's the solution Labour would like, but the reality could prove complicated.
A windfall tax is a very good and easy political statement, but actually levying it targets not just pension funds, but it also might take money away from the green transition as well.
Well, I don't accept that. Actually, if you look at who owns BP's shares, a very small percentage of it is owned by pension funds. And more broadly, these fossil fuel companies are not primarily investing in the green transition with this money. This is going back to shareholders in share buybacks.
Oil companies already pay higher tax than other firms, but BP's boss has described it recently as a cash machine, wounding words when poverty for some seems the price of profit for others. Helen Smith, Sky News.
Well, alongside these big profit announcements are reports that oil extraction in the North Sea is expanding. According to the Daily Telegraph, the Chancellor has requested that the final approval of 6 new oil and gas fields currently under consideration is fast-tracked to deal with the energy crisis. So what is really happening in the North Sea? Well, Sky's climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter is here to explain. So, Hannah, what's going on then behind the scenes?
Very interesting story, this one. Anyway, you've got the North Sea situation, which is awkward for the government. You've got an ongoing fossil fuel extraction industry working away off the UK's shores, which doesn't go so well with the UK's position as a global leader on climate change. And now you have this new reporting in several national newspapers that the Chancellor himself asked the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, to fast-track the approval of several new licences in the North Sea. Now, government sources have told Sky News that absolutely didn't happen, didn't recognise any characterisation that the Chancellor had inserted himself into that process. I think it's also worth saying that that report, or those sets of reports, is very difficult for the government, because in previous periods, particularly in relation to controversial oil fields like Cambo, for example, the Business Secretary and others have been an absolute pains to say we can't get involved in what is an arm's length regulatory process. That would be improper. We don't have the power to do so. Separately, the North Sea as a story for the government, as an awkward story for the government, isn't going away. It's trying to walk a tightrope at the moment. There are some within the government, obviously, who want to keep the North Sea fossil fuel industry going, if not to collect more tax as they earn more profits, but to keep big companies in place so that they can invest in renewables in the UK. But there are others within the government, like Alok Sharma and Conservative MPs, who are saying we have to move away from fossil fuels further and faster so we can get to renewables, we can make that transition happen faster, because we are supposed to be a global climate change leader.
Hannah, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take a look at how oil and gas are contributing to our energy in Great Britain right now. And you can see on our data dashboard here that gas is currently making up about a third, just over a third of our energy mix at the moment. And renewables, which includes things like solar, but mostly wind, taking up about a bit over 37%. And here you can see the global CO2 emissions, that number ticking up all the time. Well, now for some of the other climate news of the day. And nature-friendly farming, such as introducing measures like ditching artificial fertiliser or boosting hedgerows, could slash the UK's carbon emissions equivalent to taking 900,000 cars off the road. That's according to a new WWF UK report. The charity is calling on the government to set out a path to slash greenhouse gas emissions in farming by more than 35% by 2030, which could help boost populations of vulnerable species.
Before the COP26, we saw this big plan come forward, but there was a piece missing of that jigsaw, and that is that land, food and agriculture strategy. And we need to make sure that now, for farmers, that's what they're calling for, and for environmentalists as well, we're saying this jigsaw, it's a big opportunity. Let's take that opportunity and move forward.
Germany has appointed the Executive Director of Greenpeace International as its new climate envoy. Jennifer Morgan is taking on the role in Germany's new centre-left government after the country pledged to reduce its emissions. Italy's government is working on a new multi-million euro package to help consumers with the rising cost of energy. The urgent package, worth at least €5 billion, is an attempt to cushion the blow of rising prices as Europe tries to cope with one of the worst energy crunches in history. The government has allocated €10 billion since last July to tackle energy bills. Now, the United Nations is warning that millions of people are facing severe hunger in the Horn of Africa due to record droughts. Now, according to the World Food Programme, an estimated 13 million people across Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia are facing severe hunger in the first quarter of this year because of drought conditions. Now, it's prompted a regional drought response plan for the Horn of Africa, calling for $327 million, with 4.5 million people in immediate need of help. Well, in Somalia in 2011, a severe drought contributed to a famine, killing 260,000 people. And now the World Food Programme predicts that the number of acutely food insecure people is expected to increase from 3.5 to 4.6 million between February and May 2022. A warning that our Africa correspondent John Sparks' report includes images of animals which have died because of the drought.
The crops have withered, the grass has turned to dust, and the animals that support millions are dying. Where seasonal rains brought life to the borderlands of Ethiopia, Somalia and Kenya, bone-dry winds now blow. It hasn't rained here for 3 years. Most people here are pastoralists. They follow their animals and live from the land. But the shortage of water has driven many into camps. Thousands live here in this ad hoc settlement in Ethiopia, and the aid agencies are struggling to feed them. The UN says 13 million are facing severe hunger. Others still crisscross the territory, searching for water if their livestock can manage it. But if the animals die, malnutrition typically follows, for they are the only source of meat and milk. UNICEF says hundreds of thousands of children are now at risk of severe malnutrition.
What will happen, in your view, if we don't get significant rainfall in April?
Oh God, no. This, it is a possibility which I would not like even to think of, but professionally I have to. And I think it can be a real catastrophe, a huge catastrophe.
In Somalia, the drought has been particularly fierce. 90% of the country has been affected, and many have abandoned their homes in search of food and water. Aid agencies say there is still time to act, but the lives of millions are at risk. John Sparks, Sky News.
And finally, a film that we've talked about a fair few times on this show has been nominated for an Oscar. The End of the World satire Don't Look Up is up for Best Picture after prompting some varied reviews. The film's director, Adam Kay, said he was inspired to write the movie by his terror about the climate crisis. Do stay tuned. Coming up here on the Daily Climate Show, I'll be joined by Seppi Golzari-Munro, Deputy Director of the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and David Wallace-Wells, journalist and author. And we'll be discussing the big oil's big profits and global food production. Do we need systemic change? Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Now we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Deputy Director at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, Seppi Golzari-Munro, and journalist and author David Wallace-Wells. So good evening to you two. So, first of all, renewed calls today for a windfall tax on oil and gas companies as BP posted record profits for 2021. Now, profiting from high energy prices while consumers are hit by ever higher bills, these results follow big losses in 2020, and BP is talking big on climate targets. By 2030, half of its spending will be on low carbon energy rather than oil and gas. But is that enough? So, Seppi, BP's profits may be hard to stomach for some, given the rising energy bills that people are contending with, not to mention the climate crisis. But the company themselves argue that they're trying to fund a hugely expensive shift towards greener forms of energy. So they would say, leave us alone. We need to make these profits.
Well, it appears that their plans towards these more investment in renewables were actually made before the they understood the extent of their profits for this year. So I'm not sure that their plans are predicated on the profits that they've made this year. But also, actually, you know, we've seen that they are giving out, you know, money to their shareholders. They're paying that money out, and it really, you know, it's appealing for some to think that actually, well, you know, that money could be used instead to alleviate this cost of living crisis that so many in the UK are facing.
David, what's your take on this? Do oil companies need these big profits in order to fund the transition to greener alternatives?
Well, they're private companies. To the extent that they are participating in this transition, they require some capital. But I'm skeptical that their motivations are as pure as their leaders suggest. I mean, when you look at this spending, it is significant. I don't want to say it's nothing, but they're still spending considerably more money opening up new oil and gas capacity, which is in direct violation of what the IEA said was necessary to allow the world a chance of staying to 1.5 degrees of warming. They said that meant no new investment in new oil and gas infrastructure at all going forward starting today. And BP is among the best performing oil and gas companies when it comes to the renewable transition. And yet still they're spending considerably more money on the old dirty kinds of energy than on building out their renewable portfolio. So I think we have to understand some of the, you know, they are making a shift here, but the scale of that shift is as important as the fact of it. And the scale is, according to the IEA and the IPCC, still woefully insufficient.
Seppi, yeah, they would argue, no doubt, that we still do need these fossil fuels while we transition. We still need gas in this country, for example, until there's enough renewable infrastructure there to replace it.
I mean, I think that just looking again at the actions and not words, just wanted to highlight, sorry, Anna, that the investment in renewables from BP actually halved between 2018 and 2019. So I think I agree with David that we need to see some more action and not just words. And on your point about, you know, the need for fossil fuels, well, that is in the CCC's pathways, etc. But it's vastly reduced. We know that we don't need any new oil and gas, but also we know that actually the IEA, who are not a radical body, by the way, they're very conservative actually, have said that it's not only that we shouldn't go after the new oil and gas, is that actually if countries listened to their advice on the pace at which to pursue renewables, countries and companies, then we just wouldn't need as much oil and gas as, you know, these companies are suggesting. So I think we just need to be quite careful. You know, we've already got so much knowledge about the reserves that are available, that are extractable. We know that we need to keep much of that in the ground anyway. So it just seems like throwing good money after bad to pursue new investments here.
And David, you're in the States at the moment, and there are hearings going on looking at various fossil fuel industries, sustainability pledges, and examining them. I mean, how much awareness, public awareness, is there of what's going on? And could this prove to be some kind of watershed, do you think? Could it shift public opinion on what's going on?
Well, I don't think these hearings in particular are going to mark a dramatic break in public opinion, but I do think that we're living through a relatively rapid cultural shift that is, you know, meaning more and more people are regarding and treating the fossil fuel business as a kind of a villainous entity in our lives and our world. It's not the matter of one hearing or one climate summit or one report, but I do think that shift is moving forward. And I think that's one of the main reasons why so many of these companies are at least paying so much lip service to the green transition. They don't want to lose customer support and the cultural cachet that they've had in the past, or at least don't want to lose it as quickly as they might otherwise lose it. But you know, whether or not what that means in terms of emissions and their production, I think is very much an open question. And there was a big new study that came out yesterday. It wasn't just looking at oil and gas companies, but 25 major multinational corporations who had made net zero pledges, and found that actually in aggregate, those net zero pledges only amounted to a reduction of about 40% of those companies' emissions, not 100% as the term net zero implies. I think we're seeing something quite similar across the economy, maybe even most especially in the fossil fuel sector, where companies are saying that they're moving much faster than they really are.
OK, interesting. Well, let's move on to our second topic right now, because a complete change in the way we produce food could be one of the big solutions to climate change. Not only could regenerative farming help biodiversity, claims a new report from the World Wildlife Fund, but the emission savings would be the equivalent of pulling nearly 1 million cars off the road in the UK. So, Seppi, the WWF, who did this report, say that farming and nature have to be front and centre of the government's plans to hit net zero. The government, though, would say it's already shifted its policy on farming towards being more environmentally friendly. The NFU, the National Farmers Union, would say the same. So how necessary do you think this call is?
Well, I think we just need to look at it in the round. And as you say, the UK is making steps. I would say that it's not quite there yet. There's still a lot of policies that need to come into place to make sure that farmers are supported to work with nature and not fight against it in order to make a living. But I think more broadly, taking a step back and thinking about actually what do we need to do with our global food system, including in the UK, to actually have an impact on climate change. It was really, really strikes you that we need to look at food waste as well as amongst all of these other kind of more headline grabbing options, because if food waste were a country, it would be the third biggest emitter. Actually, it contributes up to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot it's a very complex system, and there's not kind of just one solution that's going to kind of be the silver bullet here, unfortunately.
David, would you agree with that? I mean, and farming, obviously a big business in this country, but in the States, it really is enormous, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's dominated by big ag in a way that is almost unimaginable elsewhere in the world. I mostly agree. I think that these practices, these innovative techniques, maybe it's a little misleading to call them innovative because some of them are sort of ancient, just repurposed for modern ends. They can make a difference. They're really important to implement. They can really meaningfully reduce our emissions in the UK and around the world. But they themselves will not solve the problem of food emissions. The report that you mentioned, I think, said that implementing these practices would be the equivalent of taking 900,000 cars off the British roads, and that's really significant. On the other hand, there are, I think, 32 million cars in the UK right now. So we're not talking about, as Seppi said, a single silver bullet solution. It's one tool among many, many, many that we'll have to implement. Important, but not sufficient on its own.
Yeah, and Seppi, there's a focus on issues like hedgerows and fertilisers, for example, in the report, but ultimately, is what's going to really make a difference as far as agriculture and emissions is concerned, people changing their diets and eating less meat?
Look, I mean, I think, the eating less meat point is quite... I think it's quite complicated because not all meat is made equal. There's a huge difference between, a cow reared on a tree-covered hillside in northern England with kind of the beef that's imported from Brazil on land that's been deforested, that was part of the Amazon previously. So I think it's really difficult to kind of make these broad statements. I think what we can see is a trend amongst Brits that, they're just eating less meat anyway, both for kind of the planet, but also for their own health. I think it's something around 17% less meat being consumed by Brits on an annual basis. So there is a trend there, but I think, again, we just need to be a bit nuanced about when we're talking about, meat, because it's not all the same. It doesn't all have the same kind of carbon intensity. In some forms of agriculture, with cows and sheep can actually help regenerate the land as well.
OK, we must leave it there. Sorry to cut in. Seppi Golzari-Munro and David Wallace-Wells, really good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed. And that's it from me, but tomorrow I'll be joined by climate justice activist Michaela Loach and chairman and founding director of climate change think tank E3G, Tom Berg. But thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.